There is a forest outside Rostov-on-Don where the trees remember things people would rather forget. In the autumn of 1978, a child's body was found near the Grushevka River. She had been stabbed 52 times. Her eyes had been gouged out. She was 9 years old. Her name was Lena Zakhanova, and she was the first, but no one knew that yet. The Soviet Union in 1978 was a nation that officially did not have serial killers. Serial murder, according to Soviet ideology, was a product of Western capitalism, a disease of corrupt, decadent societies. The USSR had no such thing. And so when Lena's body was found, the investigators did not look for a predator. They looked for someone convenient. They found a man named Alexander Kravchenko. He had a prior conviction. He confessed under interrogation. Methods in Soviet Russia were not gentle. He was executed. Andrei Chikatilo went home to his family. He graded school children's essays the next day. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yablushny in the Sumy Oblast of Soviet Ukraine. To understand the man he became, you must first understand the world he was born into, because that world was itself a kind of madness. The year was 1936. 3 years earlier, the Soviet Union had experienced the Holodomor, the great famine engineered by Stalin's collectivization policies. In Ukraine alone, estimates suggest between 3 and 5 million people starved to death between 1932 and 1933. Villages were stripped of grain, families ate grass, tree bark, leather, some ate the dead. Andrei's mother, Andrei Chikatilo, told him something he never forgot. She told him that his older brother, Stepan, had been kidnapped and eaten by starving neighbors during the famine. Historians cannot confirm this story. It may have been true. It may have been a traumatized mother's way of explaining an earlier loss. But Andrei Chikatilo believed it. He grew up with the image of his brother consumed, devoured, erased, and that image lodged somewhere deep in the architecture of his psychology. The village of Yablushny had no electricity, no running water, no medical care worth speaking of. The Chikatilo family, his father Roman, his mother Anna, and Andrei, lived in a single-room mud hut. Roman Chikatilo was conscripted into the Red Army during World War II and spent years in German captivity. This, too, was dangerous. Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans were considered traitors by Stalin's government. When Roman eventually returned, he was treated with suspicion, not relief. The family bore the stigma. Andrei was, by all accounts, a withdrawn and fearful child. He suffered from enuresis, bedwetting, well into his teenage years, a condition that brought regular humiliation and his mother's cold, contemptuous rage. He was academically bright, but socially isolated. He had no friends to speak of. There was one more thing. Andrei Chikatilo suffered from hydrocephalus, excess cerebrospinal fluid, which doctors would later speculate may have caused organic brain damage affecting impulse control and sexual development. He was also, almost certainly, profoundly impotent from early adolescence onward. His sexual development was stunted and broken in ways that left him burning with shame that never, in 56 years of living, found acceptable release. Andrei Chikatilo experienced school as both a refuge and a source of suffering. He was an intelligent and academically capable student who read extensively, especially in literature, history, and social theory. In the Soviet system, where academic achievement and discipline were highly valued, he appeared likely to succeed. However, his school years were difficult. Classmates often mocked him for his awkwardness, insecurity, and physical traits. He struggled to build relationships and had trouble understanding ordinary social dynamics. Later in life, Chikatilo described a particular incident from adolescence as emotionally significant. The experience was accompanied by intense shame and confusion. Biographers and researchers have suggested that such experiences may have contributed to the development of his personality and later psychological problems. Despite his internal struggles, he worked hard to present himself as a model Soviet citizen. He participated in youth organizations, tried to meet social expectations, and avoided attracting negative attention, especially given his family's difficult status after the war. After finishing school, he applied to the law faculty of Moscow State University, but was rejected. The refusal deeply disappointed him. He later worked as a telephone operator, and in 1957 he was drafted into the Soviet Army. Military service did little to change his situation. He remained socially isolated and withdrawn. He served in communications and was considered disciplined, though otherwise unremarkable. When he was discharged in 1960, he was 24 years old and still struggled with personal relationships and social connection. At the same time, he had already learned how to appear ordinary, calm, reliable, and outwardly well-adjusted. In 1963, Andrei Chikatilo married Feodosia Odnacheva. The introduction was arranged by his younger sister. Feodosia, known as Faina, was described as a quiet and ordinary woman who hoped to build a stable family life. To her, Andrei appeared intelligent, reserved, and harmless. Their marriage, however, was troubled from the beginning. Later accounts suggested that Chikatilo experienced serious sexual and psychological difficulties, which affected their relationship. Despite this, the couple had 2 children, a daughter, Ludmila, born in 1965, and a son, Yuri, born in 1969. During this period, Chikatilo pursued a career in education. After earning a correspondence degree in Russian literature and philology, he became a teacher of Russian language and literature in Novochakhtinsk. To colleagues, he seemed quiet, disciplined, and politically reliable. He followed social expectations and attracted little attention. But among students, concerns began to emerge. Over time, allegations of inappropriate behavior toward students were reported. Complaints were made within the school system, but no serious investigation followed. Instead, administrators often transferred him to different schools, rather than publicly addressing the accusations. Many researchers later viewed this as an important institutional failure. Avoiding scandal was often prioritized over confronting misconduct directly, allowing problems to remain hidden instead of properly investigated. As the years passed, Chikatilo continued teaching without arrest or major scrutiny. Behind his outwardly ordinary appearance, however, his psychological instability and destructive impulses were reportedly becoming more severe. By 1978, Andrei Chikatilo was 42 years old. Over the years, he had constructed the appearance of a respectable Soviet citizen. He was married, had children, worked as a teacher, and participated in public life. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed ordinary and unremarkable. Privately, however, he was struggling with increasingly severe psychological problems and violent impulses. Earlier incidents of misconduct had never been properly investigated, allowing him to continue living without serious scrutiny. In December 1978, while temporarily living in Shakhty, Chikatilo encountered 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova near the Grushevka River. According to later confessions considered credible by investigators, he lured the child to a small house he owned nearby and killed her there. The crime marked a major escalation in violence and became one of the earliest murders later connected to him. Afterward, He disposed of the body in the river and returned to his normal life without attracting immediate suspicion. The investigation that followed became one of the most controversial aspects of the case. An innocent man, Alexander Kravchenko, was arrested, convicted, and ultimately executed for the murder. Chikatilo himself was questioned briefly but not pursued further. Investigators saw him as a conventional and socially stable figure, a teacher, husband, and party member, and attention shifted elsewhere. This failure allowed him to remain free for many more years. Between 1978 and 1981, Andrei Chikatilo killed no one. This is a period that criminologists find instructive. Serial killers do not always operate on consistent cycles. Life circumstances, employment, housing, family dynamics can suppress or delay compulsive behavior. Chikatilo had moved, changed jobs, and was in a period of relative external stability. But stability is not the same as resolution. The compulsion does not disappear during dormant periods. It waits. In 1981, Chikatilo took a job as a supply clerk with an industrial organization, Rostov-on-Don. The job required him to travel constantly across the region, to railway stations, to bus depots, to the transit nodes of Soviet provincial life. He was alone much of the time. He was anonymous in ways that a teacher in a classroom never could be. The dormant period ended. On September 3, 1981, Chikatilo encountered 17-year-old Larisa Tkachenko at a bus stop near Rostov. She was known locally as a girl with a difficult home life. Impulsive, often drunk, willing to go with strangers for the price of a meal or a bottle. Chikatilo offered both. She accepted. He took her into a patch of woodland near the road. What happened there was qualitatively different from Lena Zakotnova, more violent, more extended, more deliberate. He had had 3 years to think about December 1978, and what he had thought in the sealed-off basement of his psychology was this: he wanted to do it again. Larisa Tkachenko's body was found with extreme injuries. She had been strangled. She had been bitten. Chikatilo later said he consumed some of her tissue. In 1982, he killed again and again. In 1 year, 1982, he claimed victims in Krasnodar, in Shakhty near Rostov. The victims ranged in age from 9 to 19, boys and girls both, runaways, children who had wandered from supervision, young people waiting at bus stops and train stations who saw in Chikatilo what he wanted them to see: a tired, ordinary, middle-aged Soviet man who knew the right bus to take and offered to show them the way. By 1983, Soviet investigators had a pattern on their hands. They simply did not yet understand what pattern it was. The bodies were found in forests. Almost always forests. This was not coincidence, it was method. Chikatilo was intimately familiar with the woodland areas surrounding Rostov-on-Don, Shakhty, Novoshakhtinsk, and the dozens of smaller towns connected by rail across the southern Soviet Union. He knew which woodlands were used by whom. He knew which paths led away from view. His victim selection was not random, though it appeared so on the surface. The victims fell into several categories. First, young runaways and homeless children, particularly those who lived around railway stations. Soviet Russia had a persistent problem of besprizorniki, homeless, parentless, or runaway children that the state preferred not to acknowledge. These children existed at the margins of Soviet society, already invisible to the systems that should have protected them. Second, young women with reputations for instability or promiscuity, girls and women that Soviet society had already quietly written off, those with alcohol problems, those with troubled family histories, those who hitchhiked or accepted rides. Third, young boys, often from dysfunctional homes, who were drawn by the promise of money or food. What united these victims was not age or gender, but vulnerability and invisibility. Chikatilo selected people who were already not being watched. His approach was consistent and calculated. He was well dressed for a Soviet working man. Coat, briefcase, the visual grammar of minor authority. He would approach his target at a transit point, a station, a stop, a market, and engage in conversation. He knew how to talk to children. He was a teacher. He was patient, calm, non-threatening. He would offer food. He would offer to show them a shortcut through the forest to somewhere they needed to go. He would offer warmth, guidance, the ordinary promises of a helpful adult. Once in the forest, he moved quickly. The murders were characterized by extraordinary violence. Chikatilo stabbed victims dozens of times, sometimes over 50 times. He targeted the eyes particularly. He mutilated bodies in ways that investigators found almost incomprehensible. Forensic analysis showed evidence of biting, of cannibalistic acts, of extended post-mortem injury. Sexual forensic evidence was, initially, completely baffling to investigators. Chikatilo's blood type registered as AB. His secretions, however, registered as a different type entirely, a rare biological anomaly called non-secretor status, where blood type antigens are not expressed in bodily fluids. This meant that forensic samples taken from crime scenes consistently pointed to a blood type that did not match the suspect when tested conventionally. This anomaly would protect Chikatilo for years. By 1983, at least 14 people were dead. The investigation that would eventually catch him was about to begin and fail and begin again. In 1983, Soviet investigators formally opened what they called Operation Lesopolosa, the Forest Strip Investigation. The name came from the Lesopolosa, the windbreak strips of forest that Soviet agricultural planners had planted across the southern Russian steppe in the Stalin era. Linear belts of trees that ran for kilometers between fields. The bodies were being found in these strips, these in-between places, these thin corridors of trees that were everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The lead investigator was Mikhail Fetisov, a senior officer of the Rostov Oblast Criminal Investigations Department. Fetisov was a Soviet policeman of the old school, methodical, politically cautious, operating within the constraints of a system that did not want to admit it had a serial killer, because admitting it had a serial killer was politically problematic. The Soviet state could not, ideologically, produce monsters of this nature. Serial murder was a Western pathology, and so even as the body count rose, there was institutional pressure to find alternative explanations. A gang, multiple perpetrators, organized crime. Something that could be explained without implicating the Soviet social order. Investigators collected evidence. They built files. They interviewed hundreds, then thousands of people. They created one of the largest criminal databases in Soviet history for a single case. And in 1984, they caught Andrei Chikatilo. He was stopped near Rostov's Central Park, behaving suspiciously, approaching young women and children, making contact and then withdrawing. He was brought in for questioning. His name was run through the database. His name was already in the database. He had been questioned briefly in connection with the 1978 death of Lena Zakotnova and had not been eliminated. Now investigators took blood samples. The blood test came back type A. The forensic samples from the crime scenes indicated a type AB secretor. Andrei Chikatilo was released. The investigators moved on to the next name on the list. In 1984, Andrei Chikatilo killed, At least 8 people. 8 people in a single year. This represented an escalation that serial killer profiling had not yet, in the Soviet context, developed the vocabulary to describe. The FBI's behavioral science unit in Quantico had been developing criminal profiling methodology through the 1970s and early 80s. But the Soviet Union did not have access to this work and would not have admitted to needing it if they did. The escalation followed a pattern consistent with what criminologists call the cooling-off period shortening. Early in a serial killer's career, the period between offenses tends to be longer, months, years even, as the behavior becomes more entrenched, as the compulsion deepens and the internal inhibitors erode. The cooling-off period compresses. The killer needs the act more frequently. The relief lasts for a shorter time. Chikatilo was also becoming more confident. 15 years of successfully evading consequence had taught him that his mask was effective. He had been questioned and released. He knew investigators were looking. He knew approximately what they were looking for, and he continued anyway. The victims in 1984 ranged in age from 10 to 30. They were found across a wide geographic area. Chikatilo's job as a supply clerk required extensive travel, and he used this cover systematically, killing in cities and towns far from his home, where his face was unknown. He killed in Aviators Park in Rostov, a public green space, in August of 1984, murdering a woman named Natalia Shalapanina in broad daylight. The audacity of this was extraordinary, but the Lesopolosa, the forest strip, could be found even in urban parks. Even in cities, there were in-between places. Even in Soviet cities, there were people who were already invisible. By the end of 1984, the official death toll connected to the investigation stood at 32. The real number may have been higher. Investigators had hundreds of suspects. They had spent millions of rubles. They had interviewed thousands of people. They did not yet know they were looking for a school teacher with a briefcase who could pass a blood test. The institutional failures in the Chikatilo case did not occur in isolation. Soviet criminal justice of this era operated under what might be called the presumption of confession, the idea that a confession obtained through interrogation was the most important form of evidence. Physical and forensic evidence was secondary to an admission of guilt. An admission of guilt, under Soviet interrogation methods that ranged from psychological pressure to outright torture, could be obtained from almost anyone. This was not a new observation. Soviet jurisprudence had been organized around this principle since the Stalinist show trials of the 1930s. By the 1980s, it was simply the way things worked. In the early 1980s, investigators, under massive institutional pressure to solve the forest strip killings, arrested, interrogated, and obtained confessions from multiple innocent men. Alexander Kravchenko, as we have noted, was executed in 1983 for the 1978 murder of Lena Zakotnova, Chikatilo's first victim. Other men were arrested, held, and in some cases convicted for murders they did not commit. The psychological devastation inflicted on families who believed their loved ones had been killers, only to learn, years later, the truth, is a chapter of this story that is rarely told and never adequately addressed. There is also the case of Andrei Slivko, a separate Soviet serial killer operating in Stavropol during some of the same years. When investigators discovered Slivko in 1985 and realized they had found a different serial murderer, not their forest strip killer, the confusion added another layer of institutional chaos to an investigation already strained past its limits. The Soviet criminal justice system was being asked to do something it had never been designed to do: to systematically investigate and prosecute a type of crime it had officially declared impossible. And across the region, through the summer and autumn of 1984, the forest strip killer continued. Between late 1984 and 1985, Chikatilo's killing rate slowed dramatically. This was not, investigators would later understand, because he had stopped wanting to kill. It was because he had been arrested on a minor charge, theft from his employer, and had spent time in custody before being released. More significantly, the heightened police presence in Rostov following the investigation had made him cautious. He adapted, he pulled back, he waited. During this period, Chikatilo changed jobs again. He left Rostov-on-Don and took a position with another industrial enterprise. The change moved him to a different network of railway routes, different stations, different provincial towns. In 1985, he killed twice. In 1986, twice more. The pace was slower, but the compulsion had not diminished. In 1987, 1988, and 1989, the killings resumed at varying rates, sometimes one a year, sometimes 3 or 4. The investigation had, in effect, grown cold. The massive operation of 1983 and 1984 could not be sustained indefinitely, and Soviet bureaucracy had the capacity to exhaust its own momentum. Files were maintained, the case remained open, but the active manhunt had reduced. Chikatilo killed 11 people between 1985 and 1989. Each time, investigators would reinitiate activity, increase patrols, check names. Each time, the killer was careful, patient, geographically flexible. He killed in Krasnodar. He killed in Moscow. Once on a trip to the capital. He killed in Zaporozhye in Ukraine, nearly 1,000 kilometers from Rostov. By the late 1980s, investigators had quietly revised their working theory. They no longer assumed a local man. The killer moved. The killer traveled. The killer used the Soviet railway system the way a hunter uses a forest, as cover, as access, as anonymity. They were closer, but they did not yet know it. In 1985, a detective named Viktor Burakov was assigned to lead the Lesopolosa investigation. Burakov would spend 6 years of his life on this case. By the end of it, he had lost weight he could not afford to lose, developed a stress-related illness, and carried the case with him in ways that did not end with the arrest. Burakov was not the kind of investigator the Soviet system typically produced. He was methodical, obsessive, and willing to question assumptions. He read Western criminological literature wherever he could find it, no easy task in Cold War USSR. He sought out Soviet psychiatrists, forensic experts, behavioral specialists trying to build a profile of the killer from evidence rather than ideology. One of the experts he consulted was Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, a Rostov psychiatrist who would play a critical role in the case's eventual resolution. Bukhanovsky had developed a psychological profile of the killer, detailed, remarkably accurate, built from forensic evidence and behavioral theory. He concluded that the killer was almost certainly male, middle-aged, heterosexual, but with profound sexual dysfunction, educated, superficially conformist, experienced with transit and travel, able to appear unthreatening to children and women. The profile was quietly extraordinary. In a country without criminal profiling as a discipline, Bukhanovsky had independently constructed something close to what the FBI's behavioral science unit would recognize. Burakov used the profile. He reorganized the investigation around it. He narrowed the parameters. But narrowing parameters in a region of several million people, with a suspect who traveled constantly and had an unusual forensic signature, was not a fast process. Burakov's team worked. They documented. They checked names. Andrei Chikatilo's name appeared on the list multiple times. He had been questioned in 1979 and again in 1984. The blood test in 1984 had cleared him. He remained on the list, but not at the top. Burakov would later say that what kept the investigation alive in the years when it could have been quietly closed was the knowledge of what it meant to stop more dead children, more families who would never know what had happened. He could not live with that outcome, and so he continued. In 1990, Andrei Chikatilo killed 9 people, 9 in a single year, more than in any previous year, more, criminologists would later note, than is typical even for serial killers of this duration. Several interpretations have been offered. One, that Chikatilo, now in his mid-50s, was physically aging and psychologically fragmenting, and that his self-control was deteriorating as a result. 2, that the political upheaval of 1990, the Soviet Union was visibly disintegrating, the certainties of the world he had lived in were collapsing, created a kind of external chaos that mirrored and amplified his internal one. 3, simply that at this stage, the compulsion was total and he had lost whatever remained of his capacity to suppress it. The victims in 1990 were found in Shakhty, in Rostov, in the surrounding forest strips that had now become, in the minds of investigators, almost sacred in their significance. One victim was an 11-year-old boy named Vadim Gromov, found in July. Another was a 13-year-old girl named Lyubov Zuyeva, found in August. The investigation went into maximum intensity. Bus stops and train stations were watched. Police presence increased dramatically. Plainclothes officers were stationed at the transit nodes where victims had last been seen. On October 30th, 1990, a police officer named Igor Rybakov noticed a man coming out of woodland near a commuter railway station at Leskoz. The man was middle-aged, wearing a gray coat. His briefcase was with him. His face was flushed. He had mud on his boots. The officer approached him, asked for identification. Andrei Chikatilo produced his documents calmly. He explained he had stepped into the trees to relieve himself. The officer noted his name, checked his identification, and sent him on his way. A report was filed. 3 days later, the body of 22-year-old Sveta Korostik was found in the same woodland. She had been killed on October 30th. When Burakov's team reviewed the patrol reports, they found the name Chikatilo. For the third time in 11 years, the system had Andrei Chikatilo's name in its hands. This time, it did not let go. On November 20th, 1990, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was placed under surveillance. For several days, Burakov's team watched him. He traveled normally, he went to work, he visited a clinic for minor treatments. On November 20th, investigators followed him to a marketplace in Novocherkassk. He approached a young woman, made contact. She declined and moved away. At that point, the decision was made. They arrested him. Chikatilo's initial reaction was calm. He was a Soviet citizen, a party member, a man with documents, and a wife and grown children. He was polite, quiet, cooperative. He gave them nothing. This calm would persist for the first several days of interrogation. Chikatilo was no stranger to being questioned. He had been questioned before and had walked away each time. He understood in some cold and functional part of his mind that they needed more than his presence at a woodland to convict him. Investigators brought in Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky. Buchanovsky did not interrogate Chikatilo. He talked to him. For 3 days, hours of conversations, Buchanovsky applied psychological insight, empathy, and the detailed profile he had built over years studying this case without ever meeting the man at the center of it. He told Chikatilo he understood him. He told him, clinically and without judgment, what he believed had happened to him, the childhood, the sexual dysfunction, the cascade of trauma and repression and compulsion. He told Chikatilo that the confession was not the end, but the beginning of understanding, of being understood. On November 30th, Andrei Chikatilo began to confess. He confessed for weeks. He described 56 murders. He described them in extraordinary, accurate detail. Locations, methods, victims that investigators could verify against their files. He led police to victims who had not yet been found. Most remarkable, he showed at times a kind of relief, as if the weight of the secret carried for 12 years across hundreds of thousands of kilometers and 56 lives had become heavier than he could stand. He did not weep, he did not beg. He explained, with the academic precision of a man who had been a literature teacher, what he had done and why. The trial of Andrei Chikatilo began on April 14, 1992, in Rostov-on-Don. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary event. In the courtroom, in the streets outside, and across the Soviet Union, which by this point had ceased to exist. The USSR had formally dissolved in December 1991. Chikatilo was tried by the Russian Federation. The trial lasted from April through October. Chikatilo was charged with 53 murders. 3 of the original 56 could not be sufficiently evidenced in court, though he had confessed to them. He was represented by counsel, a man named Yuri Yuzhanin, who argued that his client was not legally sane and should be committed rather than executed. The courtroom scenes from the trial are among the most extraordinary in the history of criminal proceedings. Chikatilo appeared in a large iron cage, standard practice for high-security defendants in Russian courts. He was thin, gray-haired, and behaved during much of the trial in a manner that prosecutors and observers debated endlessly. Was it genuine mental deterioration or calculated performance? He shouted at witnesses, he sang, he exposed himself. He read from papers he had prepared. He delivered incoherent speeches about espionage and Soviet betrayal. He claimed at various points to be pregnant, to be a Communist Party martyr, to be a foreign agent. The families of victims were present in the courtroom. Many of them, seeing this display, were enraged, not because they believed he was sane, but because any possibility that he might avoid execution on grounds of insanity was, to them, a final and unbearable injustice. Mother after mother stood in that courtroom and described what had been taken from them. Fathers who could not speak, siblings who had been living with absence and nightmares for a decade. 4 psychiatrists examined Chikatilo and concluded he was legally sane at the time of the offenses, capable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions, capable of controlling his behavior. On October 14, 1992, Judge Leonid Akubjanov delivered the verdict. Guilty on 52 counts of murder, guilty on 1 count of sexual assault. Sentence: death. Chikatilo heard the verdict calmly. He made no visible reaction. His defense immediately appealed. The appeal was rejected. The Russian Supreme Court upheld the verdict in 1993. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was executed on February 14, 1994. He was 57 years old. The method was a single gunshot to the back of the head, standard Russian execution protocol. It was carried out in Novocherkassk prison. He was not told the exact date of execution in advance. consistent with Russian practice, which holds that the condemned should not have the opportunity to prepare a final performance. There were no reporters present, no family, no ceremony. He is buried in Novocherkassk. The grave is unmarked or has been repeatedly vandalized. No monument exists, no memorial. For the families of his victims, the execution brought something, not peace. Peace is rarely available in the aftermath of such crimes, but a finality, an acknowledgement in the most absolute legal language available that what had happened was real, was wrong, and was answered for. Some families said it was not enough. It will never be enough. In the years since 1994, Viktor Burakov has spoken publicly about the case. He carries it with the specific exhaustion of someone who spent 6 years hunting a man whose victims he had to photograph, inventory, and file. He has spoken about the failures, the 1984 release, the wrong men prosecuted, the institutional resistance to acknowledging what the evidence clearly showed. He does not sound like a man at peace. Dr. Bukhanovsky continued his psychiatric work in Rostov. He has been consulted in subsequent Russian criminal cases. His profile of the Lesopolosa killer, built from evidence and psychology in a country that didn't believe serial killers existed, remains one of the more remarkable documents in the history of criminal psychiatry. Feodosia Chikatilo, his wife, moved away from Rostov after the trial. She gave 1 or 2 interviews in which she described her life with him as quiet, unremarkable, without obvious warning signs. She said she had known nothing. Investigators and psychologists have spent decades debating that claim. 56 lives, that is the number the court accepted. Chikatilo himself said 56. Some investigators believe the real number may be higher. Victims whose remains were never found. Cases in distant regions that were never linked. The youngest confirmed victim was 7 years old. To speak of legacy in such a case is to enter uncomfortable territory. There is the legacy of the victims themselves, the families who live with absence, who grew up with a missing sibling or a lost child, who spent years not knowing, who spent more years knowing. That legacy is not the property of the perpetrator. It belongs to the people who carry it. But the Chikatilo case also changed things. In Russia, it forced the first serious acknowledgement that serial murder was possible. Not a Western pathology, but a human one, capable of occurring in any society. It forced reforms in forensic evidence standards. It contributed to the development of criminal profiling as a legitimate discipline in Russian law enforcement. The case of Alexander Kravchenko, the innocent man executed for Chikatilo's first murder, became a reference point in Russian debates about capital punishment and the reliability of confessions. It did not end capital punishment in Russia, but it was remembered. Internationally, the case attracted extraordinary attention. Books were written, documentaries produced. A film, Citizen X, was made in 1995 and is considered one of the more accurate and serious dramatizations of a serial killer investigation ever produced. Chikatilo himself became, in some quarters, a subject of morbid cultural fascination, the mild-mannered schoolteacher, the literature lover, the Soviet everyman whose interior life was a landscape of sustained horror. This fascination is understandable in a human sense. It is also worth examining critically. What Chikatilo teaches us is not exotic. It is not the lesson of a monster beyond the range of human comprehension. The lesson, more uncomfortable, is this: that the systems meant to protect people, schools, law enforcement, courts, failed repeatedly, over 12 years, to stop someone who was not hiding as carefully as we might imagine. He was hiding in plain sight, and the systems that should have seen him were looking away. for Lena Zakotnova, 9 years old, who was the first for all of them.